All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. So today we are going to be looking at Britain and the Caribbean. We're going to look at Bermuda. We're going to look at Jamaica, a little bit of Jamaica, and then we'll talk about indentured servitude and slavery. So let's get this party started. Britain and the world. That's what I want. Share. Oh, oops, spoiler alert. You've seen it. This is not the PowerPoint you're looking for. There we go. All right. So as always, key terms, hard words. Let's get started. So we're looking at Bermuda. We're sort of Bermuda as American question mark because it's interesting. Just to give you guys a map. Bermuda, always seen or always perceived as, oh, it's part of the Caribbean, is actually, if you look at it, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. It's pretty much same latitude as latitude as Georgia, whereas Caribbean is typically in the Caribbean. So that's where we're looking. So Bermuda as American question. All right. So we're going to look at the origins of the colony, and then look at Bermuda as a company colony. Now, I'm looking at Bermuda because Bermuda was the second, get my face up there, was the second official English colony in the New World after Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown, if you remember, founded in 1607. And the English colonization of Bermuda actually starts as an offshoot of the Jamestown colony. So this gentleman on the left, that is Admiral George Somers, Somers. And on 2 June 1609, Somers set out from England with 9 ships and between 500 and 600 men. Let me rephrase: 500 to 600 new settlers, because men was a problem in Jamestown. 500 to 600 new settlers and supplies destined for the Jamestown colony. Jamestown, again, located roughly right here on the map. This fleet was the relief fleet of the Jamestown colony to help resupply the colony. And so, floating along, sailing along, Then on the 23rd of June, 2/3 of the way to Jamestown, a hurricane struck and scattered the fleet, including Somers' flagship, the Sea Venture. The ship, piloted by Somers himself, fought through the storm for 3 days, taking on water before finally seeing land on the 26th of June. With his ship floundering, Somers steered his ship directly into the reefs off the island, beaching the vessel and allowing all 150 men, women, and children, and 1 dog, to safely land on shore via the longboats. The colonists in the Sea Venture started to settle down. They built houses and a church out of the local lumber and living off of the local fauna, including wild hogs. Now, for Somers and his officers, they began building 2 smaller vessels out of the remains of the Sea Venture and using the local timber in Bermuda. Naming the ships the Deliverance and the Patience. Gotta love the naming. 142 castaways left Bermuda in May 1610 and set sail for Jamestown. Now you might be going, well, 142, well, wait a sec. Math. That's not 150. So we have to account for 8. So 5 men had previously rigged a sail to one of the longboats and attempted to sail to Jamestown. And if you've ever watched Mutiny on the Bounty or read Moby Dick or anything, a longboat is not a big boat. Big enough, but it's not set for oceanic sailing. So they tied a mast, rigged a sail to it, and tried sailing to Jamestown from Virginia from Bermuda. Alas, they were lost at sea and never seen again. So that accounts for 5. Summers would fill the ships up with supplies, particularly pork, to help feed the settlers and to finish their mission to resupply Jamestown. Now, to ensure English claims to the island prior to leaving for Jamestown, Summers left 3 volunteers on the island, on Bermuda, to ensure English claims to the island and continued Virginia Company support for colonization. Bermuda will claim its origins from the point that Summers was shipwrecked on the island in 1609, rather than the first actual colonization in 1612. Don't worry for those 3 men. A relief fleet was sent, a couple more settlers. They started out with a military fort and then started building it up. The first actual settlement would take place in 1612. But for Summers, when they arrived in Jamestown in May 1610, they found a colony on the verge of destruction. They expected to find 500 settlers in Jamestown, but they only found 60 alive. 60 of the expected 500 settlers were still alive in Jamestown, suffering through what has become known as starving time. Because, this Summers was in charge of the relief fleet, and the rest of the supply fleet, scattered by the hurricane, did not make it to Jamestown and either returned back to England or simply did not survive the storm. While the supplies from Bermuda did help, the colonists in Jamestown voted to board the Deliverance and board the Patience and head back to England. The colony of Jamestown was only saved by the arrival of another relief fleet from the Virginia Company. They thought Summers was at Davy Jones's locker. They had no idea if he was alive, dead, or what. So once they heard that a hurricane had done a number on this fleet, they immediately set up getting another fleet and sent it on its way. Now, some people did end up leaving on the relief fleet. They basically said, "Screw you guys, I'm out of here." But the second relief fleet, as well as Summers sailing from Bermuda to Jamestown, allowed the Jamestown colony to survive. So again, we have Bermuda now English territory. And so let's see how they set things up. Bermuda as a company colony. Now, this is a map of Bermuda. Similar to most English colonizing efforts during this period, Bermuda started off as a joint stock colony. What this meant was that the colony was funded through a mix of royal funds and a mix of independent financing through the selling of stocks in a company. And so it's a way of mitigating risk. It's a way of spreading the risk around, so that and colonies are a very risky business. So if a colony does not survive, one group or one person or one country isn't hit hard. The risk is mitigated through the selling of stocks. And so through the first 6 years, through 1615, Bermuda was operated under control of the Virginia Company. This was the company that colonized Virginia. In 1612, the first governor, Richard Moore, Moore, and 60 settlers arrived in Bermuda and established the first English settlement in St. George. The initial settlers came to farm and attempted to institute the plantation system that happened in Virginia, tried to put it into Bermuda. Now in 1615, a group of investors created the Somers Isles Company, SOMERS, Isles, ISLES, company, to run Bermuda separately from Virginia. So this way, Virginia would have its own company, Bermuda would have its own company, so that Bermuda would be a little more independent. Now, granted, investors in the Somers Isles companies were primarily the same investors as the Virginia company, but they wanted a separate charter. They wanted a separate legal agreement for Bermuda than the one that they had for Virginia. And so from 1615 to 1684, the Somers Isles Company would run Bermuda as a joint stock colony. Bermuda would shift to a royal colony in 1684. Now, what did the company do? Well, the company split the island into 9 separate parishes. Each sort of line of demarcation, each parish, each area was named after an investor in the company, and then each parish was subdivided into lots that equated into shares of the company. 1 share equals 1 lot. The 9th parish, which held the capital, St. George, was designated as a common parish, or the king's parish. So that would not be that would be sort of the hub of the island. Now, looking at this map, each tribe or each parish was named after investors. So we have Pembroke tribe, Pembroke parish, Paget's tribe, Warwick tribe, Southampton tribe, Sandys tribe, etc., etc. And each tribe, each parish was subdivided into lots. And as we could tell, some tribes, some parishes are more split than others. So if we take Southampton, we have, what is that? I believe 16 different lots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I don't know why lot 1 is up there. My guess is that would be the most fertile land. By the way, just for future reference, because we're going to talk about it in a second, Port Royal is located right down here. So the tribes broken up 9 different parishes, and each parish subdivided into lots, each lot equating to 1 share. So different investors, the risk is mitigated to different degrees. So for Southampton, it's out of this group of shares, it's subdivided into 16. Warwick, however, had more investment. So the risk is mitigated into 50 different shares. And so what this also means is because each lot is 1 share, different areas, Warwick tribe, for example, with 50 shares, Pembroke with 27, had different voting power. So not only was it different economically, it was also different politically. Speaking of politics, so politically, Bermuda was set up in a similar manner to many other English colonies. You have a 2-house legislature, a bicameral legislature, established to provide a semblance of self-government to Bermuda. A colonial legislature was established in 1620. This would be the 2nd legislative house officially created by the English government in the Americas, after the House of Burgesses, and sat for the first time in late 1620. The legislature was elected by the settlers of the colony with suffrage, that is, a right to vote, limited to white male landholders. And so, colonial legislature elected by the House. The Upper Council The upper house was created out of the voting shareholders of the Somers Isles Company. This was very much like an appointed council that operated much like the Senate, much like the Canadian Senate, except it had real power. The upper council could veto any legislation passed by the colonial legislature, as well as approving the appointment of the governor. So if the upper council did not like the governor, they could simply go, no, we don't like this guy, appoint someone else. And so the governor would be appointed by the company with the advice and the consent of the upper council. So the company had the really two major branches of government under wraps in this political system. When Bermuda shifts to a royal company, when Bermuda shifts to a royal company in 1684, the upper house is essentially wiped out. So just erase that. I mean, now that's a royal colony, there's no need for a company council, right? It makes sense. So they just got rid of the upper council, and the crown starts appointing royal governors to oversee the colony. Economically, Bermuda runs as a plantation-style economy during the company years. So prior to 1684, Bermuda runs as a company colony. And as previously noted, in fact, I will go back to there. As previously noted, Bermuda is essentially broken into lots that reflected shares in the company. And to make their money, investors need a return on their investment, right? So investors insisted that tobacco be grown on the land, often in a plantation-style economy. Now, the problem with tobacco was Bermuda did not and does not have the best land to grow tobacco. I mean, think about it. When was the last time you heard someone just enjoying a fantastic Bermudan cigar? Exactly. Now, one of the things that Bermuda did have, however, was cedar trees growing all around the island. And so what would typically happen is the cedar tree, they would harvest the cedar, and they would make these immaculate, beautiful boxes that the tobacco would be placed in and then sent back to London. And more often than not, the tobacco that was sent from Bermuda would be burned, not sold. I mean, it simply was just such of a poor quality that it didn't really make any sense to even try selling it. And then the cedar boxes that it was sent in would be the money maker for the investors. And when the colony shifts to a royal colony, the economy of the colony the economy of Bermuda shifts as well. In particular, the economy shifts to a maritime economy focused on fishing, focused on whaling, focused on privateering, piracy. Bermudan, there we go, ships coming out of Bermuda became notorious as commerce raiders, going out, sailing, attacking Spanish, Portuguese, any non-English ships that they could find, sailing out and seizing commercial vessels. And salt. Salt also became a key export for Bermuda as a royal colony. In fact, Bermuda will colonize the islands of Turks and Caicos, seen here, in 1681, and started raking and mining salt on the islands. Now, the Turks and Caicos had previously been depopulated by the Spanish, as Spanish slave traders seized the entire population of the islands within a year of their discovery for working on their mainland colonies, as well as their colonies in Cuba and Hispaniola. Salt was particularly important for salt curing meat, particularly fish. which was very important at a time when refrigeration was virtually non-existent. So Bermuda, similar but different. I mean, tried doing the plantation style economy unsuccessfully. Similar with respect to the political system. So is it American? Is it Caribbean? Is it kind of in that, I have to use it, is it in that kind of Bermuda Triangle of are we or aren't we? Yeah, it kind of is. So let's turn our view then towards the Caribbean in particular, and let's look at Jamaica. And Jamaica is interesting because whereas Bermuda was colonized by the British, the case of Jamaica was Britain taking a colony away from Spain and imposing the British way of life on the former colony. Now, Jamaica was originally colonized by the Spanish. Jamaica, just south of Cuba to the west of Hispaniola. And it was strategically located because really one of the best ways to get into and out of the Caribbean is right between Cuba and Hispaniola. And so Jamaica more or less controls the mouth of the Caribbean, for lack of a better term. Jamaica, discovered by Columbus in 1494. The Spanish established the first permanent settlement on the island in 1509 and settled the capital of the colony, Santiago de la Vega, just another Santiago, known as Spanish Town, in 1534. Now I have to bring back English and Spanish competition at this point. Because remember, and so we're looking at the 17th century, 1600s. And if you remember how we had English and Spanish competition as one of the reasons behind British exploration and colonization, well, it was also behind actual war between England, Spain, and other colonizing powers. Because by the 17th century, sugar had become a prime commodity coming out of the Caribbean, and the English wanted in on it. And this idea was reminiscent of the commerce raiding done 50 years earlier by the Sea Dogs during Elizabethan England. The key difference being that because the target was sugar, then it involved land, particularly the occupation of territory. And so in 1655, Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, the monarchy was out of England at the time. England was in charge of Oliver Cromwell, who styled himself as Lord Protector. He ordered attack on Spanish landholdings in the Caribbean with the objective of capturing Hispaniola for the English. He wanted this big island. He wanted Hispaniola under British control. And so he sent two men. He sent William Penn on the left and Robert Venables on the right, in charge of a fleet to go and capture Hispaniola. And upon arriving in the Caribbean, the British under Penn and Venables laid siege to Santo Domingo, but was forced to withdraw. Now these two men were rather concerned over their failure to seize Hispaniola. They were worried about what Cromwell would do to them and their families. And so Penn and Venables, the leaders of the expedition, decided to turn their sights to the less well-defended, but rather nearby, Jamaica. And so they arrived on the 19th of May, 1655. The British overwhelmed the 1,500 Spanish men, women, and children in little more than a week. On the 27th of May, 1655, Spanish and British officers signed an agreement whereby Jamaica would be permanently annexed by Britain. Now, that's not to say that Britain was A-okay with Jamaica, or Spain was A-okay with Britain taking Jamaica. Britain still faced opposition to their occupation of Jamaica. On the island itself, you had renegade Spanish forces making common cause with Maroon communities on the island. Now, a Maroon community, or a Maroon, were communities made up of runaway slaves from Spanish plantations. And you would have Maroon communities of runaway slaves in Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, Virginia, Louisiana. Basically, anywhere there was slavery, you would have communities of hidden runaway slaves. And so you had the Spanish forces engaging in small-scale guerrilla war against British, taking pot shots every now and then. Outside of the island, outside of Jamaica, Spain made 2 aborted attempts to try and retake the island. And to ensure resistance should the Royal Navy be unable to support Jamaica, should the Navy simply not be around at the time, the British governor, I didn't have his name, the British governor of Jamaica, looking at the wrong name, the British governor of Jamaica, Edward, E-D-W-A-R-D, Dooley, D''O-L-E-Y. Edward Dooley wanted to make sure that Jamaica was still protected if the Spanish Navy wasn't around. So he invited a loose coalition of pirates to make Port Royal, Jamaica, their home port. I'm talking pirates, I'm talking the Caribbean. I have to bring in the pirates of the Caribbean. Dooley's thinking was that these pirates and privateers had A, their own ship, and B, self-interest to protect Port Royal and Jamaica overall from any Spanish attacks. And so these pirates would engage in raids against Spanish holdings in Cuba, in Hispaniola, elsewhere, to ensure that the Spanish would not be able to engage in many, if at all, any offensive operations against British holdings, particularly Jamaica. Now, the Jamaican politics, roughly the same with respect to what happens, because many of the Spanish were exiled shortly after the British conquest of the island. There really was little challenge to the imposition of the British political system to Jamaica. So what we find in Jamaica is very much similar to what we find in Bermuda. A colonial legislature elected from the population of white male landholders, headed by a governor appointed by the crown. All right, that's the easy part of this lecture. Next, we're going to start talking about Britain and labor. Now, slavery is going to be introduced to the American colonies, to the North American colonies, in 1619, when a Dutch ship arrives in Jamestown with between 12 to 20 slaves. Slavery will arrive in the Caribbean much sooner than that. But in the American colonies, slavery initially was not the key source of labor. The key source of labor, probably up until 1676 or so, is going to be indentured servitude. Because, I mean, widespread settlement to grow tobacco, and you need the labor to work the land. And so what we would find with indentured servitude would be a lower class white Englishman or white Englishwoman would enter into a contractual legal relationship with somebody of the upper class. And so white Englishmen and women would agree to sell their labor for a set period of time, generally between 5 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the colony. So it's important to note this is contractual labor. It's like if you signed a contract to work the oil fields. You have a 3-year contract. These are the rules. These are the regulations that the company must follow. These are the rules and regulations you must follow. So because it's contractual labor, this means indentured servitude is not an inherited status. Any child produced during this period of labor, pardon the pun, would not become an indentured servant himself. And so we have an agreement between an upper class individual or company and a lower class individual. Generally, again, they would sell their labor for a set period of time between 5 to 7 years in exchange for passage to the colony. And they would be treated as property for the period of their servitude. And because this is a legal document, because they are in effect treated as property, their contracts could be sold. It's not really that common, but it could be sold to somebody else. At the end of the term, they would receive freedom dues. This could be money, this could be tools, this could be seed, this could be sometimes, not often, but land. But it's important to note that this is not slavery. This is entered into voluntarily. You have a limited term of service, and children did not inherit the status of their parent. To give you guys an example, here we have a indentured servant contract. So we have Michael Geiger, that's the name right there, signs this in his own free will and accord for in consideration of the sum of 7 pistoles paid by this man, blah, 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 has bound and put himself and these presents doth bind and put himself servant into the said name to serve him to serve him and his attorney and executors, administrative, blah, 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 for and during the full term of 3 years, during which time said person shall behave himself obedient and faithful in all things as a good and dutiful servant ought to do. So that's his side of it. For 3 years, behave obediently and faithfully in all things as a good and dutiful servant ought to do. And as for the other side, shall provide said servant during that time with sufficient meat, drink, clothing, lodging, and washing, fit and necessary for him in the station of a servant. And so this was signed in 1744 in the 18th year of His Majesty's reign. So this was, I believe, an indenture from South Carolina. So that's indentured servitude. Again, this is a contractual agreement, contractual labor. Everybody's entering into it with of their own accord. Now, if we look at Virginia, up to about 1660 or so, Virginia was a society with slaves. That is, if you took slavery away from Virginia in 1660, the society could continue to function. Post 1660, Virginia was a slave society. That means after 1660, slavery was integral to the functioning of Virginia as a society. By 1700, 1 in every 3 people in Virginia was a slave. And you have, why did this happen? Well, you have the legal establishment of slavery in Virginia, and after that, a massive importation of slaves into into the colony. Now, the legal establishment was a slow shift for Virginians because you had to try to set up the notion in mind and society that white equals free and black equals slaves. And that took a lot of time to legally establish in the colony of Virginia. Now, there are some factors in this shift towards slavery. Well, first and foremost, we have the fear of the landless. If you remember, when I was talking about Virginia, 1/4 of the population was part of this underclass. And as more and more and more indentured servants were living through their contract, they didn't receive land as their freedom dues, but rather they would receive a little bit of money or a little bit of seed. And so they were forced to go further and further west in Virginia. And what we have happening is in 1676, we have a rebellion of former indentured servants in Virginia that scare people enough to go, hey, we need to stop doing indentured servitude and we need to start shifting towards slavery because slaves are with us forever. In addition, you have a shift in supply and demand. By the 1670s, by the 1680s, you have a loss of excess population in Britain, while at the same time you have the expansion of slavery with a greater supply of slaves and a lower death rate in Virginia, which meant healthier conditions. It meant that for landholders, slavery simply became more cost effective. It became more cost effective to buy a slave than it, for however long they live, than it would be to purchase an indentured servant for a period of 5 to 7 years. And then last but not least, in this factor, as a factor in the shift to slavery, you have good old-fashioned racism. You have the concept of the other, the development of a color-coded thinking in British society. And you have the British or European concept of civilized Europe versus the uncivilized African. And you have the association of blackness with barbarism or blackness with uncivilized savageness. And so Europeans start seeing Africans as less than human, which makes the decision to enslave Africans that much easier. Now, let's talk about the Atlantic slave trade, because I'm going to bring in Jamaica again. Because as mentioned, Britain wants to get into the sugar market. That's the whole reason why they took over Jamaica. So they quickly shifted to developing Jamaica into a plantation-style economy based on sugar. And unlike Bermuda and tobacco, Jamaica succeeded phenomenally. At the heyday of sugar exportation to England, Jamaica was producing 77,000 tons of sugar for England per year. What this meant for England is it meant that they had to get in on the Atlantic slave trade. So let's talk about the Atlantic slave trade. Now, prior to the 17th century, the slave trade was still primarily controlled by the Portuguese. There were still others that were involved, but not to the degree to which Portugal was. This shift started to occur, this shift away from Portugal started to occur in the 1580s, 1590s, when Portugal and Spain sort of combined together temporarily. And that was at the issue where Spain was, okay, do we still do indigenous slavery or do we shift towards African slavery? And so basically Portugal started removing itself from the Atlantic slave trade, which allowed others to enter the breach, allowed others to enter the economic breach. And in 1660, we have the formation of the Royal African Company by Britain. 1660, the Royal African Company was formed and led by the Duke of York, the future King James II of England. Now, the Royal African Company was granted a monopoly of trade along West Africa. Now, the Royal African Company was initially interested in gold and silver, but quickly realized that the real money was to be made in the Atlantic slave trade. So let's talk about the process of enslavement with the Atlantic slave trade. Now, first and foremost, we start from the interior to the coast, where we would have coastal African kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Congo. They would send raiding parties from the coast into the interior, often against kingdoms or other tribes that they might have had rivalries with. But these raiding parties would be sent to the interior to seize slaves that would be sold to the Europeans. They would be brought in chains. There we go. They would be brought in chains from the interior to the coast, where they would be placed in buildings known as factories. Now, I just want to go back to this map for a second. So these are the major 8 principal regions of activity and ports of embarkation. Basically, these are the major areas in which slavery occurred. So we have Senegambia, primarily French, the Bight of Benin. This area here is known as the Slave Coast, between the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra. Kingdom of Congo would be located roughly right around here with the Congo River, located in West Central Africa. So what would happen is these coastal regions, these coastal powers, Senegambia, Bight of Benin, Kingdom of Congo, would send raiding parties outside of their territories, to the west, to the northwest, to the north, along the Niger River, to capture slaves. And then they would be brought back to the major slaving areas, Dakar. There were 4 major ports of embarkation in the Kingdom of Congo. So Benguela, Ambrise, Kambita. If you're in the Bight of Biafra, Calabar. And once they're there, they're placed in what were known as factories. Now, a factory is not what you think of a factory today, not like an industrial factory. But a factory in this case is the center of European political, economic, and social power in that particular town or region. And within these factories, the slaves would be inspected. On the right here, we literally have a slave being weighed on a scale to determine literally a price per pound. And then once it would be inspected, it would then be decided where they would be sold. In some cases, the companies involved would actually brand their slaves in a similar manner as cattle would be branded. The Royal African Company, for example, branded their slaves with a D and a Y. This was not a pleasant experience. In these factories, we have a map on an example of what a factory might look like on the left. They would be brought, it would be determined how literally they would be weighed, and then the slaves would be placed in areas not fit for man or beast, really. I had a professor who went to West Africa and checked out, visited, took pictures of some of these areas, and literally some of these, and these are people, would be kept in the equivalent of a 2x2 stone cage. It wasn't Slavery isn't pleasant for anyone. But once the slave would arrive at the factory, once it would be decided where they would be sent, we have the second part of the process of enslavement, the Middle Passage. And in the Middle Passage, slaves, as you could tell from this plan, and this plan, this is a plan showing, I'm just reading here, a plan showing the storage of 130 additional slaves around the wings or sides of the lower deck by means of platforms or shelves in the manner of galleries in a church. The slaves stowed on shelves and below them only have a height of 2 feet 7 inches between the beams and far less under the beams. So slaves would literally be packed like sardines on ships for the up to 6-month trip to the New World. The time of travel depended on the distance traveling and the weather and sea conditions. So for about 23 hours a day, slaves would be under would be under the deck, chained, with literally only 2 feet 7 inches around them. Normally at this point, if we were in class, I would show Root, the miniseries Root, starring the wonderful LeVar Burton, shows a scene regarding the Middle Passage. I would highly recommend you searching it on YouTube and checking it out to give a sense of what the Middle Passage was like. Oftentimes, slaves would be forced to go above decks and entertain the sailors by dancing or as a means of exercise. And disease would run rampant on these ships because of the poor conditions. That's part of the reason why this is a plan trying to cram 130 more slaves on the ship, because the ship owner is trying to make money, so trying to stock as much product. There, for lack of a better term, these people are being treated like livestock, like a product. And the idea is to try to make as much money. And you're looking at 12 to 15% mortality rate in the Middle Passage. And so traditionally, pardon me, you're looking at estimates of between 10 to 15 million people going between Africa and the New World. If we're looking at even a 10% mortality rate, you're looking at 1.2 to 1.5 million people. Sorry, 1 to 1.2 million people who died along the way. And that brings us to the slave market itself, because once the slaves arrived in the New World, they would be placed in the slave market to be sold. And I would highly recommend, there's a slave market scene in 12 Years a Slave. And it is a fairly accurate representation of what a day at a slave market would be like for both the slaves and the potential buyers. Once slaves arrived in the New World, they would be placed in the slave market to be sold. Men, women, and children would come to the market and look at the buying and selling of human beings. The slaves would be treated like cattle. They would have their teeth inspected. They would have prospective owners would often bring their own medical professionals to give the slaves a once owner and be asked about what sort of skills they might have. Mothers and children could be ripped away from each other. Again, I highly recommend 12 Years a Slave. Families being ripped apart, husbands and wives, children and fathers, children and mothers. Now, I'm leery of using this analogy, but it is an analogy that I've found helps students understand the process of enslavement. I'm not using this analogy to make fun of slavery. It is a destructive, it is a vile process, but a means to help remember what the process of enslavement was like is Star Wars. Because really, if you think about it, the scene with the Jawas in Star Wars is really reminiscent of the slave trade. Jawas go out on a raiding party in their sand crawlers. They capture R2 and 3PO. They put them, they seize them, they put a restraining bolt on both of them, putting them in chains. They're placed in the sand crawler. That's the Middle Passage. Before eventually selling them to a couple of white guys. So this is not a means, I'm not making light of slavery, but rather this can be a way for students to help remember the process of enslavement. Go back to Jamaica. There we go. Perfect map. Now, Jamaica, and one of the reasons I want to come back to Jamaica, is because Jamaica was one of the main locations in the Caribbean for British bought slaves. And to give you an idea, let's look at the ratio of whites to slaves. In 1660, you have 4,500 whites on the island to 1,500 slaves. That is a 3-to-1 ratio for whites. 140 years later, in 1800, the ratio is 1 white person for every 20 slaves. So that is a 20-to-1 ratio, slave to white person. In 1834, when Britain officially abolishes slavery, you have 1,500 whites on the island, 5,000 free blacks, 40,000 mixed race, and 311,070 slaves on Jamaica. To give you an idea of how deep Britain got into the slave trade, by 1700, 1 out of every 4 ships leaving Liverpool, England, was a slave trading ship. 1 out of every 25% of every ship leaving Liverpool, England, was a slave trading ship. And much of the wealth created by the British harbour towns, by Liverpool, by Manchester, was created either directly or indirectly by slavery. 75% of all sugar produced in Jamaican plantations found their way to London to supply the growing coffee house craze. And during the sugar heyday, you have 58,000 tons of sugar going from Jamaica to London per year. Now, it's important to note that slavery in the North American colonies occurred throughout every North American colony prior to the American Revolution. Slavery is only abolished in the northern colonies by 1800. So New England abolishes the last northern state, or what would become a state, will abolish slavery in 1800. Slavery is integral. It is integral to society in the South. Slavery is a large part of society in the middle colonies, so New York, Pennsylvania, Jersey, that area, but only a small part in the South. The growth of the South and its economic development is built on slavery. Slavery in the Caribbean, slavery will continue on in the West Indies, that is the Caribbean, until the abolition of slavery in 1833, 1834, where they will shift over to the use, again, of indentured servants. For example, you have Britain controlling the Indian subcontinent. So Indians would be sent over from India to work in Trinidad and Tobago, which causes a little friction even up to today. So we have a shift from indentured servitude to slavery, and then kind of back to indentured servitude. All right, so I have talked an awful lot in the past 3 videos, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to let you guys go forth, slay dragons, and work on your Mary Hassel assignment. All right, talk to you guys later. Good luck. Bye.